If you don't want a divorce, get out of this house right now. These words came out of nowhere. My husband, James, stood before me, his voice cold and unwavering. I was taken aback. He had never spoken to me like this before. Was he so confident that I wouldn't file for divorce that he felt emboldened to intimidate me like this? For months, I had endured endless pressure from my mother-in-law and the growing weight of household responsibilities. James had not only ignored my struggles, but had begun siding with his mother, blaming me for every inconvenience in our marriage. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed advice, someone who could help me see things clearly. My name is Anna, and I'm a 30-year-old office worker. My husband, James, and I are approaching our 5th wedding anniversary. We have yet to be blessed with a child, which has led to a constant barrage of questions from my mother-in-law. When will I finally have grandchildren? She would ask, making it sound like my sole purpose in life was to give her an heir. James' father had passed away years ago, and his mother now lived off the inheritance he left behind. Without a job or any real responsibilities, she had plenty of time to interfere in our lives. Her obsession with grandchildren wasn't just annoying, it was suffocating. Every conversation circled back to the same topic. And James? He never defended me. Instead, he joined her in shifting the blame onto me. James' attitude changed drastically after we got married. The man I once loved for his kindness was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. Without even consulting me, he decided that we would live near his childhood home. From that moment on, my life turned into a nightmare. On my days off from work, I was summoned to my in-laws' house, where I was expected to cook, clean, and take care of every chore imaginable. There were no breaks, no appreciation, just more demands. While I scrubbed floors and did the laundry, my husband and his mother would watch TV and laugh together, as if I were nothing more than a maid. Once, I was even yelled at for making too much noise with the vacuum cleaner. After that, I was forbidden from using it altogether and was told to clean with a broom and a rag instead. As if things weren't bad enough, my sister-in-law moved back home. She had been living in a nearby town, but due to some personality conflicts, she had recently divorced and returned to her mother's house with her 4-year-old daughter. And just like that, my workload doubled. One morning, she casually informed me, "You should make my daughter's lunch every day." I was stunned. I have a full-time job. I can't do that. But instead of understanding, my mother-in-law exploded in rage. "Your sister-in-law is dealing with a divorce. The least you can do is help her." James chimed in as well. "Don't you want to be useful to the family?" Even my sister-in-law herself had the audacity to say, "It'll be good practice for when you have kids of your own. You should be grateful." And so, my days began at 4 a.m. I would wake up before sunrise to prepare my niece's lunchbox, cook breakfast for my in-laws, rush home to finish my own housework, and then head to work. James, of course, did nothing. The only time I had to rest was during my lunch break at work. One evening, after another exhausting day, James casually dropped a bombshell on me. "By the way, Anna, you should quit your job." I froze. What? I talked it over with Mom and my sister. You know, she's struggling after the divorce. You understand, right? "No, James, I don't understand." Instead of explaining, he snapped at me and stormed off to take a bath. How was my sister-in-law's divorce my problem? James was stuck in a dead-end job, and there were months when I earned more than him. Did he honestly think we could live on a salary alone? Neither my mother-in-law nor my sister-in-law worked. Why couldn't they handle the household chores themselves? I felt like I was losing my mind. I couldn't take it anymore. Desperate for a moment of clarity, I grabbed my car keys and drove off. There was only one place I could think of, my childhood home. My parents had moved overseas, and the house had been sitting empty for years. But it was still filled with precious memories, memories of a time when I had been loved and valued. Sitting in the familiar silence, I finally allowed myself to breathe. I knew I couldn't go on like this. It was time to make a choice. As I sat in the comforting silence of my childhood home, lost in thought, my phone suddenly rang. I glanced at the screen. It was my husband, James. "Hey, I just got out of the bath and you're gone." Are you back at your parents' place again? His voice carried more annoyance than concern. Yes, so what? I replied, my tone sharp. Could you stop running back home every time something goes wrong? We're not kids. His words made me clench my jaw. He loved my parents' house. It was spacious, well-maintained, and far better than the tiny apartment we shared. Yet, his words lacked any warmth or understanding. I'll be working from here for a while. And no, I won't be going to your parents' house either. There was a long silence on the other end before he finally spoke. Well, come back home now. His voice was stern, forceful, demanding. And just like that, I felt defeated. With a heavy heart, I returned to our house. Shortly after, I did something I had never imagined. I quit my beloved job in the fashion industry. It wasn't by choice. My clueless coworkers speculated I might be pregnant, whispering behind my back, maybe she's finally expecting? The reality was far from their sweet assumptions. I had been stripped of all freedom, forced into a life of endless housework. From morning till night, I cooked, cleaned, and managed the household. Even when I caught a cold and ran a high fever, no one in the house seemed to care. I had become a servant. No, a slave. But one day, in the midst of this miserable life, something unexpected happened. My sister-in-law was getting remarried. The news hit like a shockwave. Even more surprising, her fiancé was an executive at a major corporation, earning a substantial income. The entire in-law family erupted in celebration, shouting about how she was marrying into money. I couldn't help but feel bitter. My sister-in-law wasn't exactly a beauty, and her personality left a lot to be desired. But as they say, everyone has their preferences. She strutted over to me, a smug expression plastered on her face. Look, Anna, she beamed, shoving a photo in my face. I stared at the image, my heart skipping a beat. I knew this man. Before I could process my thoughts, James said something unbelievable. Because of this, Anna, your parents' house will become my sister's family place. My blood ran cold. Wait a minute, I said, my voice trembling. That house is what my parents left for me. It's not for you to decide. James scoffed, his arrogance suffocating the room. The whole family has decided. And you, who live off my money, don't have a say in this. I stared at him in disbelief. The man in front of me, was he even human? Or was he a devil in human skin? That house was my inheritance, the home my father had left me. A place meant for me, for my future, for my possible children. James knew this. And yet here he was trying to steal it. As if that weren't enough, my mother-in-law added her usual venom. You can't even give us a grandchild. The least you could do is be useful around the house for once. That was it. I had reached my breaking point. That night, I returned home and quietly packed my belongings. I took only the essentials, stuffing them into a small suitcase. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from determination. I was done. Without a word, I left and drove back to my parents' house. This time, it was different. This time, I had made a firm decision in my heart. I would never go back. Days passed. I received no calls from James. No apologies. No desperate attempts to bring me back. Maybe, just maybe, he had finally realized his mistakes. Or so I thought. Then one evening, my doorbell rang. I peered through the peephole. My heart sank. It was James and my sister-in-law. I hesitated before opening the door. What do they want now? What are you doing here? I asked, crossing my arms. James smirked. We thought we should take a look around. Without waiting for an invitation, my sister-in-law barged in. Wow, this place is pretty nice, she said, ignoring my protests as she wandered through the house. I stood there, frozen. They were snooping, inspecting, treating my home as if it were already theirs. Finally, my sister-in-law turned to me with a smug grin. Too good for you, Anna. One evening, as I sat in my parents' house, staring at the fading sunset outside the window, my phone rang again. It was James. And when do you plan to move out of this house, Anna? He asked, his tone casual, as if we were discussing the weather. I remained silent, gripping the phone tightly. My sister's wedding is coming up soon. Get it together, he added, impatience laced in his voice. Then came the final blow. If you don't want a divorce, leave now. I felt my stomach drop. He stood there, side by side with his sister, a smug grin on both their faces. He was so sure of himself, so sure that I would never leave. For the first time, I realized how little he thought of me. Got it, I replied simply. His eyes flickered with satisfaction, his smirk widening. That's all I wanted to hear. That night, under the guise of celebrating my sister-in-law's upcoming wedding, they left for a long family-only vacation. Naturally, I wasn't invited. Before leaving, James gave me his final command. Pack up and be gone by the time we return. I watched them walk away, chatting excitedly about their trip, never once looking back. I allowed myself a small, mirthless smile. They thought they had won. They had no idea. 2 weeks passed in peace. The morning of their return, my phone began to ring nonstop. The caller? James. Mixed in were calls from my mother-in-law and sister-in-law. I ignored them at first, sipping my coffee as I watched the sun rise through the window. But when the calls became too persistent, I finally picked up. Hey, Anna. Where the hell are you? James barked. I took a slow breath. Here it comes. I'm at home. Liar. You're not at the apartment, and you're not at your parents' place either. And what the hell is this? His voice was shrill now, filled with panic. What are you talking about? I asked, feigning innocence. Your family house. There's a for sale sign in front of it. A satisfied smirk tugged at my lips. Yeah, I put it up for sale. The silence on the other end was deafening. Then, what? What are you talking about? Well, I continued, my tone deliberately casual. After you all left, I gave it some thought. The house you're in now just seems so dirty. And you know me, I do like things to be clean. A choked sound came from the other end of the line. I'm divorcing you, James. A roar erupted from the phone. Don't mess with me. But I wasn't done yet. Let's talk through our lawyers from now on. And with that, I hung up. James was still shouting when the call ended. Before they had even returned from their trip, I had already put my plan into motion. I contacted a trusted family friend, a man who ran a real estate company. He had always been kind to my parents, and when I told him my situation, he didn't hesitate to help. With his advice, I successfully sold my childhood home for a very good price. And as for the apartment, it was in my name. James had never been able to pass the rental screening due to his poor financial history, so everything was under my control. So, before they even stepped foot back home, I canceled the lease. But I didn't stop there. I had all of James' belongings packed up and sent directly to his mother's house, cash on delivery. Now, they had nowhere to go. Even after everything, James and his family wouldn't stop calling. I ignored them, but I saved every voicemail, each insulting message, each desperate threat, each pathetic plea. My lawyer told me James was hesitant about the divorce. Apparently, after years of treating me like a maid, he had assumed I would always stay. I thought this would turn into a long battle, but then something unexpected happened. James suddenly agreed to the divorce. When my lawyer told me why, I couldn't help but laugh. James, his mother, and his sister had stormed into my lawyer's office. They declared that they wanted the divorce finalized immediately. And the reason? Since my sister-in-law's new husband is rich, we can just hire a housekeeper with his money, my mother-in-law had declared. We don't need Anna anymore. My son can find a younger, newer wife. And just like that, James agreed to let me go. I should have been angry, but instead, I felt free. Finally, after years of being treated like a servant, I was free. After the divorce, I moved on. With the money from the house sale, I relocated and started fresh. I even reconnected with my former colleagues in the fashion industry. They welcomed me back with open arms. Meanwhile, James? He learned the hard way that no woman wants to be a live-in maid. From what I heard, he struggled to find another wife. And his family? Well, turns out his sister's rich husband wasn't so generous after all. The moment he realized that they only saw him as a paycheck, he cut them off completely. James, his mother, and his sister were left with nothing. And me? I had never been happier. Because for the first time in a long time, I was finally living for myself. For a while after my divorce, life was peaceful. Taking care of myself was so much easier than I had imagined. I deeply regretted not leaving sooner. I was finally free from the burden of a loveless marriage, free from my in-laws' constant mistreatment, and free to enjoy my new life. Just as I was beginning to embrace this newfound peace, they came back. One day, out of nowhere, my ex-husband and his family showed up at my new home. Before I could even react, they barged inside the moment I opened the door. James, standing in front like some self-important king, ordered me. "We need to talk. Sit down." I crossed my arms, raising a brow. Who do they think they are? But curiosity got the better of me, so I humored them, sitting down. Then James spoke the words that nearly made me burst out laughing. "Come back home. We forgive you." I blinked. "Excuse me? They forgive me?" For a moment, I thought I had misheard. I wanted them to leave immediately, so I decided to play along, teasing. "Oh, are you talking about your sister's husband? Has he disappeared?" Immediately, their faces paled. Their eyes widened in shock, as if screaming, "How do you know about that?" "What do you know?" James demanded. His mother added, her voice a mix of rage and desperation. "After we registered their marriage, he suddenly disappeared. We can't contact him." I nearly laughed again. But what she said next was the real punchline. On top of that, he ran off with her family's fortune. A dramatic gasp might have been appropriate, but I was too busy enjoying the irony. James clenched his fists, his voice dripping with suspicion. "Was this your doing? You've cursed us with terrible fortune, daughter-in-law." I sighed, tired of their baseless accusations. So, I decided to reveal the truth. "Wow, I didn't know your sister liked hamburgers so much." James and his family stared at me, confused. "What the hell are you talking about?" his sister snapped. "Hamburgers?" I smirked. "Don't you know? Your sister's rich executive husband isn't actually some corporate big shot." Her breath hitched. "He's just a part-timer at a hamburger shop." Silence. Absolute, deafening silence. My sister-in-law froze, her lips trembling, unable to process my words. I leaned back, enjoying every second of it. In my single days, I used to visit different hamburger shops with a friend. It was our little hobby. I shrugged. There was this one shop we loved, but there was always this one employee who kept messing up orders and getting yelled at by the manager. I paused, letting the moment sink in. That man was your husband. My sister-in-law let out a strangled noise, completely at a loss for words. James' face twisted into a scowl. His mother's eyes darted between us, trying to comprehend the nightmare unfolding before her. "Of course, I recognized him from the photo you proudly showed me before," I continued. "But I figured it wasn't my place to interfere. You seemed so excited, after all." Reaching for my phone, I pulled up the hamburger shop's website and turned the screen toward them. "Here, see for yourself." My sister-in-law stared intently at the background of the picture, where her husband was clearly visible in a uniform, flipping burgers. Her breathing grew ragged. "No, this can't be," she whispered. I tilted my head. "Oh, by the way," I added casually, "I visited the shop recently, but your husband was no longer there. He probably skipped town." James' mother clutched her chest, horror creeping across her face. That's marriage fraud," James finally shouted. I smiled. "Yeah, it seems that's what they call it." Then I leaned forward, resting my chin on my hand. "I'm sorry for your loss." For a moment, none of them spoke. Then suddenly my mother-in-law snapped. Her face twisted into a mask of pure hatred as she lunged forward, screeching, "You knew, and you didn't tell us?" I rolled my eyes. "You took care of me? Excuse me? You treated me like a slave for years. And now you have the audacity to act like I owed you something?" James' mother's lips curled. "You are useless. You couldn't even give us a child." I let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, is that what you think?" I turned to James, who had gone suspiciously silent. First of all, I'm not the reason we couldn't have kids. My mother-in-law froze. Her head snapped toward her son, her expression shifting from rage to confusion. James' face went ghostly pale. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Mom, let's just go. But I wasn't done. Maybe James can fill you in on that. I watched with great satisfaction as realization dawned on my mother-in-law's face. Her eyes narrowed, her fingers tightening into fists. James, she hissed. James swallowed hard. For the first time ever, he had nothing to say. That day, my ex-husband and his family walked out of my life forever. James, humiliated beyond words, never bothered me again. His mother and sister were too busy dealing with the fallout of their fraudulent fairy tale marriage. I, on the other hand, I thrived. No longer bound by their chains, I embraced my new life, one filled with peace, happiness, and freedom. And as for James, well, let's just say, the next time I heard about him, he was still single, still bitter, and still struggling to find a woman willing to be his next servant. I smiled to myself, savoring my victory. For once, life was truly mine to live. And I would never let anyone take that away from me again. James looked guilty as he lowered his gaze, his hands clenching into fists. He knew what was coming. When we couldn't conceive after our marriage, I began, staring directly at him. We agreed to get tested at your mother's insistence. James shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but I continued. The results. I tilted my head. Nothing was wrong with me. But you, James, you had a severely low sperm count. The doctor made it clear. You were the reason we couldn't have children. A sharp gasp escaped from his mother's lips. That's a lie, she screeched. I smirked. Oh, then maybe you should ask your son why he lied to you and blamed me instead. James flinched, sweat forming on his brow. His mother turned to him, eyes burning with anger. James? For the first time, he had no words. I folded my arms. I was furious when he lied, but you know what you and your mother told me back then? I scoffed. Support your husband. Be patient. A good wife never complains. I leaned forward, voice sharp. You all refused to face the truth, so you turned me into your scapegoat instead. James swallowed hard, unable to meet my eyes. But just when I thought I had finally exposed them for who they were, he said the most outrageous thing. Look, I admit I was wrong, James muttered. Then, his lips curled into that same smug smile I had seen so many times before. But once the house sells, we'll get a good chunk of money, right? Let's all live happily as a family again. His mother nodded enthusiastically, chiming in, We've been through a lot, but let's get along from now on. For a moment, I just stared at them, completely dumbfounded. That's when I realized the truth. They didn't come here to apologize. They didn't care about me at all. They only wanted my money. No chance, I said, my voice cold. I'm not getting back together with you, and I don't consider any of you family. James' smirk faltered. Getting a little big for your boots now, aren't you? He sneered. I know you barely have any savings. Even if you sold the house, how do you plan to survive? His mother and sister smirked, as if my financial ruin was inevitable. You peeked in my bank account back when we were married, didn't you? I said knowingly. James' eyes gleamed. So now that you know, do as you're told. They thought I was trapped, that I had no choice but to crawl back to them. Oh, how wrong they were. I smiled. Sure, my savings aren't much. James grinned triumphantly. See? I told you. But instead, I cut him off. I've invested in stocks. Enough to live without working for the next few years at least. Their faces froze in horror. They wanted to say no way, but couldn't find the words. Actually, I continued. Since I was a child, my father taught me about stocks and investments. He had a knack for foreseeing trends, and I inherited that skill. I let my next words sink in. The money that helped my parents move abroad? That was all from my investments. Their faces turned ashen. I stood up and gestured toward the door. You can leave now. James clenched his fists. You. Oh, wait. I interrupted, tapping my chin in mock thought. Wasn't there something in our divorce agreement? If either of us contacts the other without a valid reason, we owe a penalty, right? James' mother paled. Are you going to pay? Or should I just call the police for trespassing? The word police sent them scrambling. Without another word, they fled. I immediately contacted my lawyer about the incident. He assured me that if they tried to contact me again, we'd take legal action. But of course, once they knew I had assets, James couldn't resist. At first, it was a flood of messages. I miss you. We were so happy before. Let's start over. Then came the nostalgic photos, old dates, vacations, anniversaries. Then came the creepy messages. I'm here right now, thinking about those days. I thought about blocking him, but instead, I saved everything as evidence. When he started contacting my friends, I decided enough was enough. I sent him one last message. If this continues, I will go to the police. Attached was a photo of our divorce agreement and the nearest police station. The messages stopped instantly. And just like that, James was finally out of my life for good. A few weeks later, my lawyer told me something hilarious. James had quit his job when his sister remarried, planning to mooch off her new husband. But now that her marriage was a fraud, he was left jobless and desperate. Eventually, he went back to his old workplace and begged on his knees to be rehired. But his former boss had been hoping for him to quit, so instead of rehiring him, they called the police on him. James ended up hopping between temporary day jobs, barely scraping by. As for his mother and sister, they were forced to work part-time at a supermarket to pay the damages I sued them for. But having never worked a day in their lives, they struggled. Their incompetence tanked sales so badly that customers gave them a nickname: the plague-bringing mother and daughter. With no savings, no jobs, and no home, they were forced to move into a rundown apartment known for crime and violence. Their fights got so loud that the police were called multiple times. Poetic justice, indeed. With their helpful contribution, I sold the house and used the money to start my own apparel company with a former colleague. We gained customers quickly, and soon, our brand was featured in magazines and TV. But best of all, I found love again. Through work, I met a wonderful man. His family welcomed me warmly, treating me with the love and respect I never knew before. And now, I'm pregnant. Next year, I'll finally become the mother I always dreamed of being. As I sit back, resting my hand on my growing belly, I think back to the past, to everything I endured, and I smile, because for the first time in my life, I am truly, completely happy. Please feel free to comment below if you like this. Remember to like and subscribers for more.